The cocktail napkin was flimsy under my thumb, but the handwriting was sharp, deliberate ink bleeding into the paper. It sat on the beige plastic tray table, a terrifying anchor. Rowan's scent still lingered in the cabin air, not the sterile oxygen of a Boeing 777, but something warmer, like amber and pressed linen. I stared at the numbers. I had boarded this flight running away from a life that had shrunk until I couldn't breathe. This scrap of paper offered a different kind of oxygen. But to understand the note, you have to understand the weight I was carrying when I walked into the terminal. Airports are designed to be transitional spaces, but Terminal 4 felt like a holding cell. I was dragging a carry-on that contained 3 days of clothes and a lifetime of hesitation. The noise was a physical weight. The relentless announcements, the screech of suitcase wheels, the performative stress of families trying to keep it together. I moved through it, wrapped in a coat that was too heavy for the season, trying to keep the numbness intact. You see, when a relationship ends the way mine did, not with a shout, but with a slow, agonizing erasure of who you thought you were, you don't just lose a partner, you lose the map. I was walking through the duty-free section, past walls of expensive scotch and perfumes I would never wear, feeling like a ghost in my own timeline. I was a woman who had spent a decade building a life based on someone else's blueprints, and now that the architect was gone, the structure had collapsed. I wasn't traveling for pleasure. I wasn't traveling for business. I was traveling because the silence in my apartment was a pressure I couldn't equalize. I checked my phone. No messages. The screen was a black mirror, reflecting a face I barely recognized. Tired eyes, a mouth set in a permanent line of defense. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to sink into the anonymity of seat 32B, put on noise-canceling headphones, and cease to exist for 7 hours. That was the goal. Erasure. The gate area was a crush of humanity. Businessmen barking into earpieces, backpackers sleeping on the floor. I found a corner near a charging station and stood there, guarding my personal space like it was the last territory I owned. I watched the flight crew arrive. They moved differently. They cut through the chaotic crowd with a synchronized, rhythmic precision that made them seem like a different species. That's when I first saw the uniforms. Navy blue, sharp lines, scarves tied with geometric perfection. They looked purposeful. I felt like driftwood. I watched them disappear down the jet bridge, a flash of red lipstick and professional detachment. I envied that armor. I envied the ability to put on a uniform and become someone else. Someone who knew exactly where the emergency exits were. When they called my group, I shuffled forward. The line was slow, a sluggish river of tired bodies. I held my phone out, the QR code glowing bright, my ticket to oblivion. I just wanted the window seat. I just wanted the dark. I stepped up to the podium, the scanner beeping a steady, rhythmic acceptance for the passengers ahead of me. Beep, go. Beep, go. I reached the agent, a harried man who looked like he'd been awake since Tuesday. I held my phone under the laser. I waited for the green light, for the permission to disappear. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, dissonant buzz. The light flashed red. Hang on, the agent sighed, his fingers flying over his keyboard with aggressive fatigue. It's flagging something. My stomach dropped. The people behind me shifted, impatient sighs rippling through the line. The numbness I had carefully cultivated began to crack, leaking panic. I didn't have the energy for a confrontation. I didn't have the energy to fight for my right to a cramped economy seat. I just wanted to go. Is there a problem? I asked, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the cavernous space. Seat assignment error, he muttered, not looking up. System kicked you out of 32B. I gripped the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles turned white. Of course. Even my escape plan was rejecting me. I was about to apologize, to step aside, to let the stream of purposeful people flow around me, when a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it had a texture that stopped the agent's typing instantly. I'll handle this one, Marcus. I looked up, and the breath snagged in my throat. The woman standing behind the podium wasn't just another member of the crew. She was an anchor in the storm. While Marcus was fraying at the edges, sweating through his polyester blend shirt, she was absolute stillness. She wore the Navy uniform with a terrifying kind of grace. The silk scarf knotted with geometric precision at her throat, her posture a vertical line of authority that made the chaotic terminal fade into the background. This was Rowan. I didn't know her name then, of course, but I felt her presence immediately, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure that signals a coming storm. She stepped around the counter, moving with a fluid economy that wasted no energy. She didn't look at me immediately. She looked at the screen, her fingers replacing Marcus's on the keyboard. Her nails were painted a deep oxblood red, clicking against the plastic keys with a rhythmic, deliberate cadence that sounded like a code being entered. "System error on the overcell," she said, her voice low and smooth, possessing the texture of polished stone. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact that brokered no argument. "I'm moving her up." Marcus blinked, looking from her to me, confused. "To business? We have a standby list. The protocol says." "I'm moving her," Rowan repeated, cutting him off not with volume, but with finality. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She hit a final key with a decisive snap, the printer chattered, and she tore the new boarding pass free. Only then did she turn to face me. The air between us seemed to thin out, leaving only the charged space where the transaction was happening. She held out the slip of paper. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly, a physical betrayal of the nerves I was trying so hard to suppress. As I took the ticket, our fingers didn't touch, but the proximity was electric. It was a heat transfer without contact, a static shock that traveled up my arm. "4A," she said. She looked me right in the eyes. Her gaze was dark, intelligent, and completely devoid of the glazed-over customer service look I was used to. She wasn't looking past me to the line of impatient people. She was looking at me. It was an unflinching assessment that made me feel like she could see the heartbreak packed in my carry-on, right next to my toiletries. "It's quieter. You look like you need the quiet." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, clutching the paper like a lifeline. I walked down the jet bridge, the transition from the humid, noisy terminal to the aircraft, feeling like crossing a heavily guarded border. The air inside the cabin was different, cooler, filtered, smelling faintly of expensive leather, recycled oxygen, and that specific pressurized silence that exists before the engines truly spool up. I found 4A. It wasn't just a seat, it was a sanctuary. The leather was soft, cool against my back as I sank into it. The legroom was vast, a luxury I hadn't budgeted for and didn't feel I deserved. I stowed my bag and sat down, expecting to feel relief. Instead, I felt a new, sharper kind of tension coiling in my stomach. I watched the economy passengers shuffle past the curtain, heading back to the cramped rows I was supposed to inhabit. I was safe here, separated by a heavy velvet curtain and a tax bracket. But then Rowan appeared in the aisle. She was checking the overhead bins, her movements efficient, almost choreographic. She reached up, her blazer shifting, revealing the line of her waist and the crisp white shirt beneath. She finished her check and turned. She caught me watching. A normal flight attendant would have smiled a plastic, polite smile to reassure a passenger. Rowan didn't. She held my gaze across the cabin, her expression unreadable but heavy with recognition. It was a look that said, "I put you there. I'm watching you." I turned to the window, staring out at the dark tarmac, my reflection ghostly and transparent in the thick glass. I had wanted to disappear. I had wanted to be invisible, to be a ghost. But as the plane pushed back from the gate and the engines whined to life, I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that for the first time in months, I was being seen. And the scariest part was that I wasn't sure I wanted her to look away. As the landing gear retracted with a heavy, mechanical thud that vibrated through the floorboards, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The harsh, clinical brights of the boarding process died away, replaced instantly by a low, dusky blue ambient glow that washed over the curved walls. It felt submarine, submerged. We were no longer simply in the air. We were sealed inside a pressurized vessel designed to keep the chaos of the world at bay. The engine settled into a deep, rhythmic hum, a constant white noise blanket that felt thick enough to wrap around my shoulders. It was a sound that usually lulled me into a stupor, but tonight, it only seemed to amplify the silence in my own head. I couldn't sleep. The leather of the seat was cool and expensive against my cheek, a tactile reminder that I was occupying a space I hadn't earned. but my eyes refused to close. They were drawn, magnetically, to the aisle. I watched Rowan work. It was a study in absolute motion economy. She moved through the darkened cabin, not like a service worker, but like a curator, ensuring her exhibits were secure. She adjusted a blanket on a sleeping passenger with a touch that was firm but careful. She closed an overhead bin with a silent, decisive click. Her movements were sharp, deliberate, and possessed a terrifying kind of grace. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. When she spoke to a passenger 2 rows ahead, I couldn't hear the words over the drone of the turbines, but I saw the posture, a slight lean, a nod that conveyed authority rather than submission. She managed the space with a detachment that I found hypnotic. She was the architect of this environment, the one holding the variables in check, and we were just occupants, living in her structure. I envied that solidity with a physical ache. My own identity felt like it had been put through a shredder, leaving me as a collection of jagged edges and raw nerves, holding myself together with sheer will and a heavy coat I refused to take off. I felt porous, as if the air pressure could blow right through me. I wondered what it felt like to be that grounded while suspended 30,000 feet above the earth. To know exactly where you stood, even when the floor was moving at 500 miles an hour. Rowan didn't look like she was running from anything. She looked like she was exactly where she intended to be. She wore her composure like the silk scarf at her throat, tight, perfect, and unmovable. She was the architect of this environment, the one holding the variables in check, and we were just occupants living in her structure. Even when she wasn't in my direct line of sight, I could feel her. It was a strange, heightened awareness, a specific frequency I hadn't tuned into before. I knew when she was in the forward galley. I could feel the shift in the air pressure when she stepped back into the aisle. I envied that solidity with a physical ache. My own identity felt like it had been put through a shredder, leaving me as a collection of jagged edges and raw nerves, holding myself together with sheer will and a heavy coat I refused to take off. I felt porous, as if the air pressure could blow right through me. I wondered what it felt like to be that grounded while suspended 30,000 feet above the earth. To know exactly where you stood, even when the floor was moving at 500 miles an hour. Rowan didn't look like she was running from anything. She looked like she was exactly where she intended to be. She wore her composure like the silk scarf at her throat, tight, perfect, and unmovable. She was the architect of this environment, the one holding the variables in check, and we were just occupants, living in her structure. Even when she wasn't in my direct line of sight, I could feel her. It was a strange, heightened awareness, a specific frequency I hadn't tuned into before. I knew when she was in the forward galley. I could feel the shift in the air pressure when she stepped back into the aisle. It was as if a line of tension, invisible but taut as piano wire, connected seat 4A to wherever she was standing. It was a proximity that ignored the physical meters between us. I would glance up, pretending to look for the restroom sign, and catch her reflection in the darkened window, or see her silhouette against the galley curtain. And every time, without fail, she would be looking back. Not staring, just aware, maintaining the connection. It was the feeling of being watched by something that meant you no harm, but certainly didn't plan to let you go. I envied that solidity with a physical ache. My own identity felt like it had been put through a shredder, leaving me as a collection of jagged edges and raw nerves, holding myself together with sheer will and a heavy coat I refused to take off. I felt porous, as if the air pressure could blow right through me. I wondered what it felt like to be that grounded while suspended 30,000 feet above the earth. To know exactly where you stood, even when the floor was moving at 500 miles an hour. Rowan didn't look like she was running from anything. She looked like she was exactly where she intended to be. She wore her composure like the silk scarf at her throat, tight, perfect, and unmovable. She was the architect of this environment, the one holding the variables in check, and we were just occupants living in her structure. Even when she wasn't in my direct line of sight, I could feel her. It was a strange, heightened awareness, a specific frequency I hadn't tuned into before. I knew when she was in the forward galley. I could feel the shift in the air pressure when she stepped back into the aisle. It was as if a line of tension, invisible but taut as piano wire, connected seat 4A to wherever she was standing. It was a proximity that ignored the physical meters between us. I would glance up, pretending to look for the restroom sign, and catch her reflection in the darkened window, or see her silhouette against the galley curtain. And every time, without fail, she would be looking back. Not staring, just aware, maintaining the connection. It was the feeling of being watched by something that meant you no harm, but certainly didn't plan to let you go. The plane leveled off, the sensation of gravity shifting from the heavy press of the climb to a lighter, floating equilibrium. The seatbelt sign extinguished with a soft, polite chime that sounded terrifyingly loud in the quiet cabin. The service was about to begin. The safety of the takeoff was over, and the real interaction, the inevitable collision of my fragility and her precision, was about to start. I smoothed the cocktail napkin on my lap, my hands shaking, waiting for her to come down the aisle. I heard the service cart before I saw it. It wasn't the chaotic metal-on-metal clatter that usually signals the arrival of pretzels and lukewarm coffee. In this cabin, the sound was different, dampened, a rhythmic, oiled glide of rubber wheels on carpet. Thrum, thrum. It was a heartbeat approaching. I stared at the beige plastic of the tray table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached, trying to arrange my face into a mask of indifference. I wanted to look like I belonged here, just another board executive flying to a meeting, not a woman who had packed her life into a suitcase in 20 minutes. Rowan moved down the aisle. I watched her silhouette against the dim blue cabin lights. She stopped at row 3, murmuring polite courtesies. It was the script. It was the performance of service. But when the cart stopped next to seat 4A, the performance dropped. The wheels locked with a decisive click. The air pressure shifted again, that strange, localized vacuum that seemed to follow her. I looked up. She wasn't standing in the standard service posture, hands clasped, smile fixed. She was leaning slightly, one hand resting on the brushed steel handle of the cart, her body angled toward me. She wasn't looking at the other passengers. She was looking at me, and the intensity made the breath catch in my throat. "White or red?" she asked. But she didn't say it with the projected volume of a flight attendant. Her voice dropped an octave, slipping under the drone of the engines, intimate and low. It was a question asked in the dark. I don't know, I stammered. My decision fatigue was absolute. I couldn't even choose a beverage. Red, she decided. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction. She reached for a bottle, heavy glass, dark label. She held it with a familiarity that suggested she knew its weight exactly. She placed a stemless crystal glass on my tray table. The sound of glass meeting plastic was sharp, a punctuation mark in the silence. She poured slowly. I watched the liquid rise, dark and viscous. It smelled of oak and deep fruit, a rich, grounding scent cutting through the sterile cabin air. She didn't look at the glass. She kept her eyes on mine. Then she stopped, the level perfect. She slid the glass toward me. Her fingers were long, the oxblood nails stark against the clear crystal. As she pushed it, her index finger brushed the back of my hand. It wasn't an accident. It was a calibration. Her skin was cool. The contact lasted a second too long to be professional. A micro moment of friction that sent a jolt of static electricity straight to my chest. I froze. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I felt the heat of her, the terrifying reality of another person breaking into my isolation. She didn't pull back immediately either. She leaned in closer, the scent of amber and pressed linen washing over me again. "You look like you're running," she said. It wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was a diagnosis. A surgical incision into the truth I was hiding. My breath hitched. "I'm just traveling," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "No," she murmured, her eyes dissecting the panic I was trying to suppress. "People who travel have a destination. You just have an exit strategy." She straightened up, the moment breaking like a fever. The professional mask slid back into place, but the eyes remained dangerous. "Drink the wine. It helps with the altitude." She moved on to row 5. I sat there, stunned, heart hammering. I picked up the glass. It was heavy. I took a sip. The wine was rich, tasting of earth. I looked at the back of her uniform as she moved away. I had spent months feeling invisible, fading into the background of my own life. And in 30 seconds, a stranger had just read my entire biography. I wasn't just a passenger in 4A anymore. I was a variable she was monitoring. For the first time since the breakup, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt solid. I felt seen. The smooth, darkened equilibrium of the cabin didn't last. It started with a tremor in the wine. I was staring at the dark liquid in the crystal glass, watching the surface tension hold, when a sudden, violent shudder rippled through the liquid, sending a red wave sloshing against the rim. The hum of the engines changed pitch, rising from a steady drone to a strained mechanical whine. Then the floor dropped out from under us. It wasn't a gradual descent. It was a physical blow, a sudden loss of altitude that slammed my stomach into my throat. The cabin lights flickered, the blue ambient glow stuttering into darkness before surging back. Around me, the hush of the business class cabin shattered. The polite silence was replaced by the sharp intake of breath, the rattle of silverware against china, and the ominous creak of the overhead bins straining against their latches. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, tight and clipped, ordering the flight attendants to their seats, but the words were swallowed by another violent lurch that threw me against the seatbelt. My reaction was immediate and humiliatingly visceral. I didn't just feel fear. I felt a complete disintegration of self. My hands flew to the armrests, gripping the leather with a force that turned my knuckles white. The physical shaking of the airframe mirrored the internal collapse I had been fighting since I walked into the terminal. This was the feeling I had been running from, the absolute, terrifying lack of control. It felt exactly like the Tuesday afternoon she had packed her bags, the moment the ground beneath my life had dissolved, leaving me falling through a space I couldn't navigate. The turbulence wasn't just weather. It was a physical manifestation of my own instability. I closed my eyes, fighting the nausea, feeling the tears prick hot and sudden behind my eyelids. I was going to shatter here, at 30,000 feet, surrounded by strangers. But I wasn't surrounded by strangers. I was being watched. Through the haze of my panic, I sensed movement in the aisle. By all laws of physics, everyone should have been strapped in. But when I opened my eyes, Rowan was there. She wasn't stumbling. While the plane bucked and heaved, throwing the service carts against their locks, she moved with a fluid, predatory balance, riding the motion of the floor like she was part of the fuselage itself. She ignored the pilot's command. She ignored the other passengers clutching their drinks. She came straight to 4A. She didn't stand over me. That would have reinforced the hierarchy, the distance between crew and passenger. Instead, she dropped. She crouched down in the narrow aisle, sinking to her heels so that her face was level with mine. The plane dropped again, a sickening slide to the left, but Rowan didn't flinch. She was a fixed point in a spinning world. "Look at me," she said. The command was low, cutting under the roar of the engines. I turned my head, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the dark ring of her iris, the absolute calm that radiated from her center. She wasn't afraid. And because she wasn't afraid, she demanded that I stop being afraid. Then she touched me. It wasn't a professional pat on the shoulder. She reached out and wrapped her hand around my forearm, her fingers digging into the wool of my sweater. The grip was firm, bordering on tight. It was a claim. The heat of her palm seared through the fabric, a sudden, shocking warmth that grounded me instantly. It was a transfer of weight. She was acting as a physical anchor, using her own stability to hold me in the seat. "I have you," she murmured, her thumb pressing a slow, deliberate rhythm against my inner arm. "The structure is sound. We're just moving through rough air. It passes." She wasn't talking about the flight anymore. I stared at her, paralyzed by the contact, feeling the precise pressure of her fingers. For a moment, the shaking of the plane faded into the background, overwhelmed by the sensory input of her touch. She held me there, in the space between the seats, tethering me to the floor, to the moment, to her. The panic that had been expanding in my chest began to recede, replaced by a heavy, languid heat. I wasn't falling. I was being held. The turbulence broke as quickly as it had arrived. The air smoothed out, the engine settled back into their rhythmic hum, and the seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin exhaled. Rowan didn't pull away immediately. She let her hand linger for a second longer, a final confirmation of the connection, before she stood up. She smoothed her skirt, the perfect professional once more, but the imprint of her hand burned on my arm like a brand. She looked down at me, her expression unreadable again, and nodded once before turning back to the galley. The turbulence was gone, but the equilibrium I had walked on with was destroyed. I wasn't running anymore. I was waiting for her to come back. I couldn't stay in the seat. The soft leather of 4A, which had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago, now felt like a containment field. The memory of her hand on my arm was a phantom weight that made my skin itch, a lingering pressure that refused to fade. I needed to move. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand up without shaking, that I wasn't just a piece of cargo being transported from one heartbreak to another. I unbuckled, the metal click sounding violently loud in the sleeping cabin, and stood up. The aisle was a tunnel of shadows, the passengers on either side reduced to shapeless mounds under airline blankets. I walked toward the front, not toward the restroom, but toward the source of the gravity that had been pulling at me for 3 hours. The forward galley was bathed in a low, golden light, distinct from the submarine blue wash of the cabin. It felt like stepping into a different time zone, a private backstage area where the performance of the flight didn't exist. I stepped through the heavy velvet curtain, half expecting to find her busy, armored in her role, organizing trays or checking manifests. Instead, I found the woman beneath the uniform. Rowan was alone. She was leaning against the brushed stainless steel counter, her arms crossed over her chest, staring out the small porthole window at the absolute blackness of the stratosphere. She loosened the silk scarf at her neck. It hung a fraction of an inch lower, a tiny imperfection in the geometric precision that felt scandalously intimate. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, but it was a beautiful, human exhaustion, stripped of the professional gloss she wore for the cabin. She didn't jump when I entered. She didn't straighten up or fix the scarf. She just turned her head, her movement slow and fluid, like she was moving through water. The air in the small space was thick, smelling of brewing coffee, burnt sugar, and that complex amber scent of her perfume that seemed to expand in the heat of the galley. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Her voice was stripped of the service cadence. It was just a voice now, husky and low, vibrating with the hum of the engines. "No," I admitted, stepping further into the small space. I should have stopped at the threshold, but I didn't. I moved until I was leaning against the opposite counter, 3 feet of rubberized floor mat between us. The turbulence woke me up. "The turbulence stopped 20 minutes ago," she countered, her eyes holding mine. "You're awake because you're trying to figure out where you're going to land." It wasn't a question. It was another read, sharp and accurate. "I have a hotel booked," I said defensively, crossing my arms to mirror her posture. "That's a location, not a destination," she murmured. She turned fully toward me then, the movement shifting the air in the cramped space. "You act like someone who burned the map before she left the house." I swallowed hard. The hum of the refrigerators and the coffee makers created a cocoon of white noise around us, sealing us in. "Maybe I did," I whispered. "Maybe the house was already burning." Rowan studied me. Her gaze was physical, a tactile sweep that took in the tension in my shoulders and the fear I was trying to hide. "Escape is easy," she said, her voice dropping to a register that resonated in my chest. "You just have to buy a ticket. But landing? That requires you to actually want to be somewhere. You have to be willing to stop moving." The subtext was deafening. She wasn't talking about travel. She was asking if I was ready to stop running. She took a step closer, reducing the distance between us to something dangerous. I could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The space was too small for 2 people who were trying to ignore the magnetic pull between them. I felt the heat radiating from her uniform, a living warmth that contrasted with the cold metal surrounding us. "I don't know how to land anymore," I confessed, the truth slipping out before I could check it. "I've been in the air for a long time." "Then you need a better ground crew," she said. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It was a slow, deliberate path. The air thickened, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to bridge the gap. Then a sharp electronic chime shattered the moment. A call light from seat 2C. The spell broke. Rowan blinked, the professional mask sliding back into place in an instant. She straightened her scarf, the distance between us suddenly vast again. "Go back to your seat," she said, but her voice was soft. "Try to sleep. We'll be on the ground soon." The cabin finally surrendered to the night. The blue, ambient glow faded to a barely there charcoal, leaving only the sporadic, glowing pinpricks of reading lights and the illuminated exit signs to map the dark. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, filled with the collective exhalations of 200 sleeping strangers. The hum of the engines became the only reality, a constant, vibrating blanket that wrapped around us, sealing us into this metal tube hurtling through the stratosphere. I should have been asleep. The wine sat heavy and warm in my stomach, and the exhaustion of the emotional marathon I'd been running for weeks pressed against my eyes. But I couldn't close them. My body was in seat 4A, but my attention was tethered to the aisle. I became a watcher. In the quiet hours, the hierarchy of the plane dissolved. There were no service carts, no announcements, no demands. There was only the stillness. And in the center of that stillness moved Rowan. She walked the length of the cabin, like a shadow detached from its source. She had shed the blazer now, moving in just the white shirt and the dark skirt, her silhouette cutting a sharp, crisp line against the dim cabin walls. I watched her check on a passenger in row 2, adjusting a blanket that had slipped. It was a gesture of such unconscious tenderness that it made my chest ache. She wasn't performing for a supervisor or a customer satisfaction survey. She was just caring. She moved with a ghost-like quiet, her shoes making no sound on the carpet. She was checking the cabin, ensuring the safety of the sleepers, but I knew, with a sudden electric certainty, that she was also checking for me. I didn't turn away when she passed my row. I didn't pretend to be asleep. I lay my head against the cool leather of the headrest and just watched her. It was a violation of the social contract, the polite fiction that we ignore the people who serve us. But we were far past polite fictions. She reached the end of the business class cabin and turned. And then she stopped. She found me in the dark. It wasn't a search. Her eyes went straight to mine, locking on with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. She stood there, bathed in the faint, watery light of the galley beyond the curtain, one hand resting on the bulkhead for balance. We stared at each other across the 10 feet of darkened aisle. It was the most intimate conversation I had ever had, and not a single word was spoken. In that silence, the noise of my past life, the arguments, the crying, the shattering of the identity I thought I owned, faded into static. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she just held the gaze. It was an acknowledgement. I see you watching. I am letting you watch. It was a permission structure I hadn't known I needed. Her eyes were dark, unreadable from this distance, but I could feel the weight of them pressing against me, heavier than the G-force of the takeoff. It was a shared secret, suspended in the pressurized air, a silent pact that existed only in the coordinates of this specific flight. For the first time in months, the terrified, frantic bird in my chest stopped thrashing against my ribs. I realized, with a slow, dawning wonder, that the sensation I was feeling wasn't the urge to run. It was the urge to stay. I wasn't just fleeing a wreckage anymore. I was being pulled toward a beacon, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with the earth below. The fear of being known, which had driven me to the airport, was suddenly replaced by a terrifying, fragile hope. I wanted her to know me. I wanted the woman who could steady a plane with her presence to steady me. The connection stretched, taut and vibrating, a high-tension wire strung between us. Then the intercom crackled. The static hiss broke the trance violently. The pilot's voice, gravelly with sleep, announced our initial descent. Rowan blinked, the connection severing as duty flooded back in. She turned, the professional armor sliding back into place, and disappeared through the curtain. The transition was violent. One moment, we were suspended in the intimate, velvet cocoon of the night flight, and the next, The cabin lights snapped on with the brutality of a prison searchlight. The soft, forgiving shadows that had allowed for our silent conversation evaporated, replaced by a harsh, fluorescent clarity that exposed everything. The worn fabric of the seats, the smudged windows, the fatigue etched into the faces of the waking passengers. It all rushed back into focus. The reality of arrival wasn't just approaching. It was threatening to shatter the fragile, high-altitude world we had built. I felt the loss of the dark like a physical amputation. The light forced me to blink, my eyes watering, my hands instinctively shielding my face, as if I had been caught doing something illicit. The plane began its final banking turn, the floor tilting beneath us, gravity reasserting its hold. The engine pitch whined higher, a mechanical scream that signaled the end of the suspension. We were going down. The bubble was popping. Then came the final pass. The secure the cabin announcement triggered a flurry of activity that felt performative and frantic. Rowan reappeared in the aisle, but the woman who had leaned against the galley counter, the woman who had anchored me through the turbulence with a single touch, was gone. In her place was the flight attendant. She had buttoned her blazer, the scarf was retied, the knot tight and perfect against her throat. Her expression was smoothed into a mask of professional efficiency, impenetrable and distant. She moved down the aisle with a large plastic bag, collecting the debris of the flight. Trash? Cups? Newspapers? Her voice was clipped, projected for the cabin, not whispered for me. She was dismantling the stage, clearing away the evidence of the last 6 hours. I watched her approach, panic rising in my throat. Was that it? Was the connection just a byproduct of the altitude? A hallucination born of wine and exhaustion that would vanish the moment the doors opened? She reached row 4. I had my empty wine glass ready, my hand trembling slightly as I held it out. I wanted to say something, to bridge the sudden, sterile distance she had put between us, but the words died in my throat. She looked busy. She looked unreachable. She reached for the glass. Her hand brushed mine. It wasn't a clumsy exchange. It was a sleight of hand, performed with the dexterity of a magician. As her fingers closed around the stem of the glass to take it away, her other hand, the one hidden beneath the small cocktail napkin she was using as a buffer, slid across the surface of my armrest. It happened in a fraction of a second. She took the glass, but she left the napkin. She didn't stop. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't smile. She just kept moving to row 5, the plastic bag rustling, her voice repeating the mantra. Trash? Items to discard? I froze. My hand was resting on the armrest, covering the small square of paper she had slipped underneath my palm. It felt hot, as if the paper itself was radioactive. It burned against my skin, a secret weight that felt heavier than the luggage in the overhead bin. I didn't look at it immediately. I couldn't. I was terrified that if I moved my hand, a flight marshal would tackle me, or worse, the paper would be blank. I waited until she was 3 rows back, until her back was turned to me. Then, with the stealth of a thief, I slid the napkin into my lap and unfolded it. It wasn't a phone number. That would have been a request. This was a set of coordinates. Written in blue ballpoint ink, in a script that was sharp, angular, and confident, were 3 lines. The Vesper Bar. The Meridian Hotel. 2200 hours. No signature, no question mark, no if you want to. It was a command. It was a location and a time. It was an invitation to continue the free fall, but this time on the ground. I stared at the ink, watching the letters blur slightly as the plane shuddered. She hadn't just seen me running. She had given me a place to run, too. The landing gear deployed with a heavy, mechanical thud that shook the floorboards. The ground rushed up to meet us, a blur of runway lights and wet concrete. The wheels slammed onto the tarmac, a violent, screeching impact that threw me forward against the seatbelt. The reverse thrusters roared, a deafening noise that signaled the end of the flight. But for the first time in my life, the landing didn't feel like an ending. I clutched the napkin in my fist, the paper crumpling against my sweat-damp palm. The flight was over, but the turbulence was just beginning. The seatbelt sign pinged off, a final, hollow note that triggered the chaotic shuffle of 200 people desperate to reclaim their verticality. The spell of the cabin was broken by the sound of overhead bins slamming open and the impatient rustle of coats being gathered. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy and strange, like I was walking on a different planet's gravity. I pulled my carry-on from the bin, the handle slick under my palm, but my other hand stayed buried in my coat pocket, fingers curled around the cocktail napkin. It was a talisman, a secret weapon against the mundane reality crashing back in. I moved with the herd toward the exit, the line shuffling forward in inches. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a physical echo of the decision I hadn't yet made. As I neared the front, I saw her. Rowan stood by the cockpit door, flanked by the senior purser. She was back in the full armor of her role, posture perfect, hands clasped, a professional smile fixed on her lips as she bid passengers farewell. "Goodbye. Watch your step. Thank you for flying." It was a recording, a loop. But as I stepped into the threshold, the loop broke. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The pressure of the line behind me was a physical force. But I slowed. I looked at her. For a split second, the smile didn't drop, but the eyes changed. The professional gloss evaporated, revealing the dark, intense intelligence underneath. She didn't nod. She didn't wink. She just held my gaze for the single second it took me to cross the doorframe, her expression stripping away the uniform and the setting. It was a look of expectation. "I gave you the coordinates," it said. "Now you have to navigate." Then I was past her, stepping onto the jet bridge, the cold, damp air of the terminal hitting me like a slap. The airport was an assault. After the hushed, pressurized intimacy of the cabin, the terminal felt violent. The fluorescent lights were too bright, buzzing with a headache-inducing frequency. The noise was a cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and the dull roar of 1,000 conversations. I walked through it like a diver who had surfaced too quickly, the bends of reality twisting in my gut. I felt exposed. The coat that had felt like armor in the departure lounge now felt flimsy. I was just a woman, standing in a baggage claim area with a broken heart and a cocktail napkin that promised... what? I stopped near the sliding glass doors, the cold night air leaking in from the curbside. This was the moment, the fork in the road. My connecting flight wasn't until morning. I had a voucher for a generic airport hotel, a safe, beige room where I could order room service, watch bad TV, and continue my erasure. That was the safe play. That was what the old version of me, the one who tried to keep the peace and color inside the lines, would have done. But that version of me had stayed on the plane. I pulled the napkin out. The ink was smudged slightly from the heat of my hand, but the words were clear. The Meridian Hotel. It wasn't the airport Marriott. It was downtown. It was deliberate. The fear was there, cold and sharp. What if I went and she wasn't there? What if this was just a game crew played to pass the time? Or worse, what if she was there? What if I walked into that bar and had to actually be the person she saw in seat 4A? The person who stopped running. My hand shook. I looked at the line of taxis waiting under the sodium lights. "Miss? You need a ride?" The dispatcher was looking at me, clipboard in hand. I looked at the voucher in my bag. Then I looked at the napkin. The safe life had left me empty. The risk felt like the first real thing I'd held in months. "Yes," I said, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. I walked to the curb. The cab smelled of old vinyl and pine air freshener. I slid into the back seat, the door slamming shut and sealing me in a new capsule. "Where to?" the driver asked, eyeing me in the rearview mirror. I didn't look at the voucher. I smoothed the cocktail napkin on my knee, tracing the blue ink with my thumb. "The Meridian," I said, "and please, hurry." The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of taillights leaving the airport. I watched the terminal fade behind us, a glowing island of transit. I was off the flight path now. I was navigating by a different star. I leaned back, the city skyline rising ahead of us like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back. The Meridian wasn't just a hotel. It was a hushed cathedral of dark wood and velvet shadows, a place designed to absorb sound and secrets. I navigated the lobby, the heels of my boots sinking into plush carpet that muffled my steps, following the subtle brass signage toward the Vesper. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest, beating against the ribcage with a violence that made my hands shake inside my pockets. I pushed open the heavy double doors. The bar was dimly lit, smelling of polished mahogany, expensive gin, and the faint, smoky scent of old leather. It felt like a decompression chamber, a ground-level continuation of the cabin's intimacy, but without the hum of the engines to hide behind. I scanned the room. It was mostly empty, just a few scattered businessmen nursing scotches in the shadows. Then I saw her. She was sitting in a high-backed leather booth in the far corner, shielded from the door. The sight of her stopped me cold. The uniform was gone. The navy armor, the geometric scarf, the badge of authority, all stripped away. She wore a loose, charcoal silk blouse that draped softly against her skin, the top button undone to reveal the hollow of her throat. Her hair was down, dark waves falling around her face, softening the severe lines I had memorized at 30,000 feet. She didn't look like a flight attendant anymore. She looked like a woman who was waiting. And that was infinitely more terrifying. She looked up as I approached. She didn't smile, but her eyes, dark, intelligent, and terrifyingly awake, locked onto mine. She set her drink down. It was neat whiskey, amber and serious. "You came," she said. Her voice was lower here, stripped of the white noise, vibrating in the quiet air between us. "I almost didn't," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I stood at the edge of the table, clutching my coat like a shield. I almost took the connecting flight. I almost ran. "But you didn't," Rowan said. She didn't gesture for me to sit. She stood up. Without the heels of the uniform, she was slightly shorter, but her presence was still massive. She moved around the table, encroaching on my personal space with that same predatory grace she'd used in the aisle. "You're tired of running." "I'm terrified," I confessed. The truth spilled out, raw and unpolished. "I don't know who I am when I'm not running. I don't know what's left of me." Rowan stepped closer. The scent of her, amber, rain, skin, washed over me, dizzying and grounding all at once. She reached out, her hand rising slowly, deliberately. She didn't grab me. She cupped my cheek, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a reverence that made my knees weak. Her skin was warm, the contact electric. "Then let me see what's left," she murmured. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, demanding everything. "I don't want the map. I want the wreckage." The space between us collapsed. I leaned into her touch, my eyes fluttering shut as the weight of the last few months, the heartbreak, the hollow identity, the fear, finally cracked. I let out a breath that was half sob, half surrender. She moved in. Her forehead rested against mine, a point of contact that felt heavier than the plane landing. "You're here," she whispered into the space between our mouths. "You landed." Then she kissed me. It wasn't a frantic collision. It was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. It tasted of whiskey and patience. It was a kiss that held the weight of every stolen glance in the cabin, every unspoken word in the galley. It was an anchor dropping into the seafloor. I gripped the silk of her blouse, pulling her closer, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of her body against mine. I wasn't floating anymore. I wasn't a ghost. I was right here, in the dark of the Vesper, being put back together by the woman who had seen me when I was invisible. The next morning, the cocktail napkin sat on the nightstand, a crumpled artifact of the risk that changed everything. I realized then that sometimes you have to let someone disrupt your flight path to find out where you're actually going. The turbulence hadn't broken me. It had just steered me home. I wasn't running anymore. I had arrived. If you've ever found clarity in the arms of a stranger at 30,000 feet, subscribe for more.